So our topic for today, guys, is supply and demand. We're going to briefly introduce supply and demand, but we're going to spend the bulk of our time on the idea of demand. So guys, we are going to be working on this topic for several class periods. We're going to look at demand today. We're going to finish it up next class period that we lecture. After that, we have to cover supply. And this is all mechanics. And it's important that you understand that what we're doing today and what we'll do next class period and probably part of the class period after that is simply mechanics. And you have to know the mechanics very, very well. It will finally get exciting when we get to put supply and demand together and actually do supply and demand problems. But we are a good ways away from that. So your task for now is to take very good notes and then practice in the homework because these mechanics are going to be very important. So very quickly, guys, when we think about the idea of supply and demand, most of the time you and I think about demand. Most of the time you and I are demanders. So when you and I go to the store, we go to Walmart and we buy stuff, we're demanders. So households, so that would be you and me, buying goods and services. So when you and I buy goods and services, that is part of demand. So I go to Walmart, I buy bread, I buy milk. I am a demander. I go buy a car. I am a demander. I buy a house. I am a demander. But I also want to point out that firms can sometimes be demanders. So firms demand resources. So if we're talking about firms hiring labor, they are acting as demanders. If I'm talking about firms buying technology, maybe computers, robotics, then they are acting as demanders. So I want you to understand that demanders can be households like you and me buying cars and houses, but demanders can also be firms that are hiring workers and buying raw materials and those kinds of things. When we talk about supply, we have the same kind of thing. Most of the time, when we're talking about supply, we're talking about firms making goods and services available for sale. So we have firms that are making goods and services available for sale. So when we're talking about firms producing computers, when we're talking about firms making movies, when we're talking about a doctor giving you a checkup, that's all supply. So firms making goods and services available for sale. But we also need to acknowledge that you and I are also suppliers. Guys, what do households, what do people like you and I supply? What am I supplying right now at Longwood University? My time. So I'm an example of what kind of resource?
Expendable.
An expendable resource? Everyone's expendable. What kind of resources, guys? You just took a test about all the stuff we've learned. So what kind of resource am I? A human resource, right? So households serve as human resources. So we supply what? Our labor. So by standing up here and teaching you, I am supplying labor to Longwood University. So we have then on the supply side, firms making goods and services, but we also have households that are supplying labor. So what I want to point out here, guys, is that we have this dual role. We've got households who are demanders of goods and services, but they are suppliers of labor. And we've got firms that are making goods and services, but they are demanders of things like labor and other inputs to production. So we see a dual role. So that dual role is for both firms and households. And we see from this very simple example that firms are both suppliers and demanders. So firms supply things and they demand things. And by the same logic, households like you and me, same type of dual role, households are both demanders and suppliers. So we want to think about this as we move into the supply and demand problems that we're going to start working. If I give you an example about Amazon, is that always going to be supply, or do you need to know more? You need to know more, right? Just because I say Amazon doesn't necessarily mean it's a supply question. It could be Amazon hiring people to do computer programming because they have a very sophisticated website. In that context, they're serving as demanders. If it's Amazon making goods and services available for sale, then it's supply. So I want to point out this dual role. However, for today, we're going to talk about demand, and we're not going to finish demand. All right? So let's move on to talk about the idea of demand. We're going to start with the definition of demand. And you need to get this all in your notes. Then we're going to pick it apart. So the definition's kind of long, and it has kind of lots of elements to it, but then we're going to go through them one by one. So when we talk about the definition of demand, we're talking about what consumers are prepared to buy, under specific circumstances So what consumers are prepared to buy under specific circumstances for a given period of time. So demand, what consumers are prepared to buy under specific circumstances for a given period of time. So let's start by picking this apart. First, let's underline the word consumers. And we want to remind ourselves that consumers can be households buying goods and services, so you and I buy bread, milk, cars, blue jeans. But what else could it be? Firms, right? Firms buying things like inputs to production. So it could be labor, capital, things they need to produce. All right. So what consumers are prepared to buy. The word consumer doesn't have to be you and me, although most often we think of consumers as people like you and me going to Walmart. Second part of this definition that we need to take a look at is the phrase prepared to buy. And when we talk about prepared to buy, we're really saying that it's not just a wish. We are in the market. We have the ability to consume. So remember, we talked about willingness to consume and ability to consume in our introduction to economics. So guys, would you consider yourselves demanders of Porsches right now? Most of you, are you demanders of Porsches? No. Even if you could afford a Porsche, would some of you choose not to? Yeah, you don't like them. You like big trucks. Okay? Okay, that was funny. All right, so prepared to buy. It's not just a wish. If somebody gave me a Porsche, I'd be happy. I'm in the market to buy. I've got the ability to buy. All right. The part that's the most confusing and the most important is this part right here, under specific circumstances. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about under specific circumstances. All right, under specific circumstances, guys. These are the variables that influence demand. The variables that influence demand. These are the variables that make demand go up or down. And notice that I'm using D for demand. So I'm going to put a little note right here. Get in the habit. D means demand. So under specific circumstances is talking about the variables that influence demand, that make demand go up or down. And we have a certain name for these variables. They are called the ceteris paribus assumptions. The ceteris paribus assumptions. It's not going to let me get the S in. Oh. Oh, hang on a second. Lost my page. The ceteris paribus assumptions. So guys, you're going to see me abbreviate these as the CPAs. All right, the ceteris paribus assumptions, the CPAs. And that is Latin for, when we say ceteris paribus assumptions, it's Latin for holding all else constant. Holding all else constant. All right. Now, we're going to be going through all of the ceteris paribus assumptions, and this is indeed the confusing part of demand. So I'm just throwing it out there right now. We're going to cover part of it today, but we're going to hit it hard our next class period, so I don't expect you to have mastered it today. But I'm going to give you an example. An example of a ceteris paribus assumption, something we hold constant, but when it changes, it can make demand go up or down. One example is consumer preferences. Consumer preferences are one of those ceteris paribus assumptions. When consumer preferences change, demand changes. So an example I have for you is the station wagon versus the minivan. The station wagon versus the minivan. Now guys, show of hands, how many of you grew up with a station wagon?
Sometimes.
How many of you grew up with a minivan? Ah, half of you. Okay. So a couple of us grew up with station wagons, and a lot of us, half of us grew up with minivans, right? So I think that over time, preferences have changed. What's happened over time? The demand for station wagons has done what? Decreased. And the demand for minivans has done what? Increased. So I don't think this is because of prices or anything else. I think this is purely a preference story. That somebody got this great idea to invent the minivan, and our preferences changed. We're like, wait, that's more space. And you know, how many of you had the minivan where you could get your kids and separate them, where they couldn't touch each other, right? Because they were like captain's chairs, right? That's like God's gift to parents, right? So DVD players in them, exactly. You could do all these cool things with your minivan. So I think this is purely a preference story, and preferences are one of those under specific circumstances. Does that make sense? But there's others, and we're going to learn them all. All right. So moving on to probably the most important law that we teach you in economics, and that is the law of demand. The law of demand. The law of demand. So guys, the law of demand explains basic consumer behavior. The law of demand explains basic consumer behavior. The law of demand is very simple. It says if the price of X goes up, whatever X is, then the quantity demanded by consumers of X does what? If price of X goes up, what happens to the amount people want to get? Goes down. Really simple, right? And if instead the price of X goes down, the quantity demanded of X goes up. So what does that tell us? The law of demand tells us that P and Q have what kind of relationship? Is it a positive relationship or a negative? Are they positively related or inversely related? Inversely related, good. They are inversely related. But there's one caveat here. The law of demand only holds when we're holding all else constant. It only holds when we're holding all else constant. In other words, I can't use the law. I can't say this is how people need to behave to be rational unless I'm holding all else constant. What do I mean when I say holding all else constant? What am I talking about? Holding what constant? Prices? No. We just talked about it. Ah, those CPAs. Good. So we're saying that the law of demand only applies. I can only talk about it being a rationality if we're holding all else constant. In other words, no CPAs are changing. No CPAs are changing. Okay? So let's illustrate the law of demand. I'm going to put together a demand schedule. So let's write out the demand schedule for Dr. Marx's consumption of avocados. How many of you like avocados? They're so good for you. That's not enough. You should eat lots of them. All right. So demand schedule for avocados. I'm sorry, you had a question. Did I answer your question? Yep. And I'm about to show you that. So the question was, can we abbreviate quantity demanded? You betcha, because that's a long phrase. We're going to use QD. So notice my demand schedule. I've got price, and I've got QD for quantity demanded. So what I'm doing is mapping together quantity demanded and price. So let's say, oh, and I need a time period. So let's say this is a period of 1 month. Okay, 1 month. And remember, demand is always defined for a period of time. I'm going to get a little careless on that. I'm going to admit I won't always say 1 month, 1 year, but it could be whatever I want it to be. So let's say that avocados cost $2 for the month. Then maybe I would eat 5 avocados. But if instead the price this month was $1.50, what does the law of demand say? Am I going to consume more or less? Yeah, more. So maybe I would have 10 avocados. But what if the price for the month is $1? Well, I would consume even more. I really like them. They're good for you. 15. And if for whatever reason avocados were selling for 50 cents, I'd probably eat one almost every day of the month, let's say 20. So this is my demand for avocados. Remember, it's what I'm prepared to buy under specific circumstances. So we're holding all those circumstances about me constant. So all those things about me that influence my demand, it's constant. And it's got to be a period of time. And I've told you 1 month. Now, let's say that we now have a change in ceteris paribus assumptions. And that change in ceteris paribus assumptions is that my preferences get stronger. And maybe my preferences get stronger because a new study shows that they fight cancer, that reduce the risk of cancer. These are good for reducing risks of cancer. All right, so I'm going to start eating more avocados probably, don't you think? If some study comes out and says, hey, these are good for reducing the risk of cancer or fighting cancer, fighting off cancer cells. So now my demand may change. At $2, instead of buying 5, maybe I would buy 8. And at $1.50, instead of buying 10, maybe I'd eat 13 a month. And at $1, instead of eating 15, maybe I'd eat 18 a month. And at 50 cents, maybe I'd eat 23 a month. So do you see what happened? A change in one of those ceteris paribus assumptions now changed my behavior. What did it do? It made my demand go what? Up or down? Demand went up, right? Really simple. Okay? Now, everybody with me? The only thing about this that's confusing is this part right here, that the law of demand only holds when nothing is changing. When nothing is changing. So I want to illustrate to you what we mean by that. Question? Sign-in sheet? Where is it? Sign-in sheets stalled somewhere. Thank you. So this only holds when CPAs are not changing. So let me give you an example so you understand why we have to say that part right there in red, that it only holds when we're holding all else constant, when there are no CPAs changing. Okay, so we're focusing on this part right here. All right, so let's say that we're in the Outer Banks. How many of you know the Outer Banks, North Carolina? So let's say that we observe that as prices of housing goes up in the Outer Banks, and for those of you that don't know the Outer Banks, it's a beach area. So we observe is that prices of housing go up in the Outer Banks, more houses are being sold. More houses are being sold. So maybe the data is looking like this. We see at $2,000, we sold 100. But then a month later, at 250,000, we're seeing 125 homes sold. So my question here is this irrational? Does it violate the law of demand? So what do you think? Is this irrational? Prices in the Outer Banks are going up. Houses are getting more and more expensive, yet more and more are being sold. Does anyone have an explanation for that? Michael, you have an explanation for that? You think it's rational? Why is this rational? Because we just said that if price goes up, quantity demanded goes down, right? Here we've got price going up and quantity demanded going up, right? Violates the law of demand. What might be a reason?
Because people want the houses so much that they're willing to pay the extra premium.
Okay, people want the houses so much. Okay, could be on the right track. What might be another reason? The real estate market fluctuates, but you guys are explaining this part. Why is price going up? I want to know this part. Why are we jumping into houses when prices are going up?
Maybe you want a vacation home.
Okay, I want a vacation home. So tell me what my thought process is. I'm watching this and I'm seeing prices go up, so I'm saying to myself, what?
Well, the price is going to go up and keep on going.
I like what you're saying. It's going to, wow, O'Shea, I'm thinking, okay, I'm in the market for a vacation home and I'm observing that prices are going up. What am I worried about? That they're going to keep going up, right? They're going to keep going up. So I say to my husband, God, we better jump in now, even though prices are rising, before they rise anymore. Is that rational? Sure. So people are thinking to themselves that prices are going to keep rising. So let's get some notes on this. So people think that prices will continue to go up. And so they want to jump in before they get any higher. So people are saying to themselves, God, let's go buy one. Prices are going up. Something's happening in the Outer Banks. Let's go buy one now before they go up anymore. So is this rational, guys? Yeah, absolutely. Now, we agree that's rational. I want to jump in before the market gets any more expensive. So now we need to figure out, how does this tie into that idea of the law of demand and whether or not this violates the law of demand? Remember, the law of demand only applies when all CPAs are not changing. They're constant. So the issue here, guys, we actually have a CPA changing. It's not one I've taught you yet. We've only talked about preferences. So is this a preference story? Probably not. I mean, do people wake up and go, yesterday I didn't want a beach house, but today I do. I didn't like beaches yesterday, but today I do. Does that sound like a preference story? No, probably not a preference story. So the CPA at work here is consumers' expectations of future prices. And that we expect price to increase in the future. So if we expect price to increase in the future, then what do we want to do? When do we want to buy this beach house? Do I want to buy it now or do I want to buy it later? If I think prices are going to keep going up, do I want to buy it now or later? Yeah, so I want to buy now or as soon as possible. Good. So do you see what I mean? Everything has to be held constant. Now, guys, my avocado example, I was holding all else constant. When I told you my preferences for avocados, when I talked about my demand for avocados, let's go back and take a look. Let's go back to our chart on my avocados. Here we go. When I gave you this machine frustrates me. When I gave you the first set of numbers in black, that was my demand, holding all else constant. My income was constant. My preferences for avocados were constant. But then, look what I did in red. I said, my preferences changed, and all of a sudden, I'm wanting to buy more, right? So, is it possible that when I go to the store and avocado prices are rising, I might buy more avocados than before if now my preferences have changed because it fights cancer? Yeah, that's rational too. All right, so you're going to have to think through that a little bit more carefully. All right, let's continue on. So, what have we just learned from the law of demand? We've learned what demand is going to look like if I graph it. So right here, we're going to draw what we call a demand curve. So that's just going to be my demand schedule. But now I'm going to graph it instead of give it to you on a table. So I gave it to you before on a table for avocados, and now I'm going to graph it. We're always going to put price on the horizontal axis. And for demand, we're going to put quantity demanded, QD, on the horizontal axis. So guys, the demand curve is going to map together price and quantity demanded. And what do we know about price and quantity demanded for demand? Do they have a positive relationship or a negative relationship? Positive or inverse? Yeah. Remember, we know that P and Q are inversely, P and quantity demanded, are inversely related. So when I say inversely related, that means if one goes up, the other goes down. So guys, if I were to plot the data I just gave you on avocados, what would it look like? Everyone draw it for me in the air. Draw it for me in the air. What's it going to look like? Well, at higher prices, $2, I'm consuming only, how many did I consume? Somebody give me the number. 5? How many avocados did I consume? 5. But at 50 cents, how many did I consume? 20. So I have a point here and a point here and some points in between. And if I connect the dots, what do I get? I get a line that looks like that. Everyone agree? So what kind of slope does that have? It has a linear slope. What kind of slope does it have? Positive or negative? Negative. Good. It's linear. So you're right. It has a constant slope, right? Constant slope, but the slope is negative. So we have a negative slope. And that comes from the law of demand, right? Negative slope. So back to those ceteris paribus assumptions, because that is confusing. What we're saying is that for this particular demand curve, we're holding all else constant. For this demand curve, we hold all else constant. In other words, all ceteris paribus assumptions are constant. They're not changing. So CPAs are not changing. So along that given demand curve, guys, our ceteris paribus assumptions are not changing. What do you think is going to happen when they do change? When a ceteris paribus assumption changes, what's going to happen, do you think? That curve is going to change. Exactly. CPAs change, and when they do, demand curves shift. So when ceteris paribus assumptions do change, then our demand curves are going to shift. So for that reason, some professors call CPAs demand shifters. And we'll be talking more about that. All right. So we need to make some key distinctions then.
What they said, demand shifters?
Demand shifters, yep. CPAs are sometimes called demand shifters, okay? But we'll cover that again. All right. So let's make a distinction then. And this is really important. Where did my pen go? Uh-oh. What's happening here? There we go. Let's make a distinction now, guys, between demand, which we're going to abbreviate with a D, and quantity demanded, which we're going to abbreviate as QD. Now, I want you to get in your notes, guys, that these are not interchangeable. You need to be extremely precise. I'm going to be extremely precise. But I'm going to tell you right now, If there's such a thing as a trick question from me, and most of the time I don't have trick questions, but I'm going to tell you right now, if there are any trick questions, they're going to be on this topic. I am going to switch these around to see if you've mastered the concepts. I'm telling you now, so it's not a trick, right? Be on the lookout for it. Be on the lookout for it. So when I use the word demand, guys, and I'm going to use them very precisely, demand is going to give us consumers' preferences. I'm sorry, consumers' behavior. I apologize. Consumers' behavior over a range of prices. Consumers' behavior over a range of prices. Emphasis on range of prices. So it's kind of like an if-then statement. If price is 5, if price is 4, if price is 3. So I've already shown that to you with the avocados, right? If price is $2, if it's $1.50, if it's $1, if it's 50 cents. So again, we always put price on the vertical axis and quantity, which is quantity demanded, on the horizontal axis. We've already said we know that our demand curves are downward sloping, so let's call that D0. And do you agree that we have a range of prices? So in my avocado example, my range of prices was from 50 cents to $2. But we also have a range of behavior. So I have different behavior. And that's in the form of quantity demand. So when I refer to demand, guys, I am talking about this complete mapping, all right? So what we're doing here is we're mapping together price and quantity over a range of prices. Okay? So be very clear. Demand is this whole thing. This whole thing. Oops, did not mean to do that. Okay. However, when I use the term quantity demanded, that's going to be something else. Quantity demanded is going to give us consumer behavior at a particular price. Consumer behavior at a particular price. So for example, I might be saying that if price equals $2, then quantity demanded equals 5. Right? That was just one point in my demand schedule for avocados, right? So I'm at a particular price. So be clear, on the left, demand, it was over a range of prices. If price is $2, I behave this way. If it's $1 this way, 50 cents this way. But quantity demanded, we only talk about at a particular price. So I can connect the two graphically. Let's do that. So again, let's draw a demand curve. So there's my demand curve for avocados. And now what we're saying is that it's not a range of prices. I know the price. The price is $2. And at a price of $2, that puts me at point A on my demand curve. And I know at $2, my quantity demanded is going to be 5. So quantity demanded, folks, is that right there, 5. So notice that we are at a point on the demand curve. We're at just one point. So demand is the whole schedule. Quantity demanded is a particular point on demand. You with me? You see the difference? And they're not interchangeable. So again, I'll tell you one more time, look for questions where I try to trick you on demand versus quantity demanded. And since I'm telling you it's not really a trick, I'm trying to make sure you understand the difference and that you're being precise, okay? Last thing that we need to talk about then is the difference between a change in demand so we need the difference between a change in demand and a change in quantity demanded, because those are also going to be two different things. So change in demand is going to be a situation where consumers buy more or buy less across all prices. Consumers buy more or they buy less across all prices. So remember my avocado example? And remember I said, okay, if price is $2, I'm going to have a quantity demanded of 5, right? And I said at a price of $1, quantity demanded was what? Somebody give me the numbers. Somebody? 10? 15? Okay. But then remember what I said? Oh, wait a minute. A new study came out that said that avocados are good for fighting cancer. So 5 became what? 8. And 15 became 18. At all prices, I wanted more avocados than before, right? That's what we're talking about here. So let's think about how we would illustrate this. Again, let's draw a demand curve. So what we're saying is at a price of $2, I was right here, but now I want to consume more than before. And at a price of $1, I was right here, but now I want more than before. And at a price of $1.50, same deal. I was right here, now I want more avocados. At a price of 50 cents, I was right here, but now I want more. Do you see what's happening here? Across all prices, I want more avocados than before. So we end up with a new demand curve. And I'm going to label that one something different. I'm going to call it D1. So what just happened to our demand curve? It shifted to the right. So if we have a shift to the right, then it's what? A demand what? Increase or decrease? A demand increase. But if it had been a shift to the left, then it would have been a demand decrease. So guys, the important thing we need to understand is what causes demand to shift like this. What caused it? What caused it in my avocado example? That study that changed my preferences, right? So what causes demand to shift? A change in what? A change in data. But what caused the change in data? We just said it. We sometimes call them demand shifters. CPAs. So what causes demand to shift? A change in the ceteris paribus assumptions, right? Because isn't that what caused me to want more avocados at every price? That my preferences got stronger because they fight cancer? All right, last thing, guys, change in quantity demanded. Here we're saying that, and I'll just do this graphically, at a price of $2, my quantity demanded was 5. But then I got up to 15, right? This is data from our avocado example. What caused that? What caused me to go from 5 to 15 in my quantity demanded? What caused that? What caused it? Price changed from $2 to $1. So I was at A, and now I'm at B, and we see right here a change in quantity demanded, right? Everyone see that? And what caused that to happen? What made me go from 5 avocados to 15 avocados? So what causes this? So what causes a change in quantity demanded? Somebody just said CPAs. Is that correct? Did CPAs cause this to happen? A change in what? Price. So it was caused by a change in price. You with me here? So very quickly, guys, last 10 seconds. Demand versus quantity demanded. They are not the same thing. Change in demand on the left is a shift of the whole curve. Change in quantity demanded, give me 10 seconds, guys. Change in quantity demanded is movement along the curve, right? Change in demand is caused by ceteris paribus assumptions changing. Change in quantity demanded comes from a change in price. And those are mechanics you have to get down, guys, and you'll be practicing that for homework, okay? All right, have a lovely weekend.